position. Before we get to the community benefits agreements, let me just ask a couple questions to you. And if you answer these in the affirmative, then I think you're in the right room to continue this discussion. Do you want tools that maximize returns on local government investment and development? Do you want programs that will transform our region through stronger, more equitable economies? Do you believe that the community benefits from smart business? Do you think that developers should be accountable for their promises to local governments and residents? And do you think that the public input results in better projects that benefit the whole community? Again, if you answered in the affirmative, you're in the right spot. What we realized when we were meeting as a group is that the nature of our environment from a political perspective is changing dramatically. The paradigm of public input is changing in Detroit. There is a renewed belief that what is good for business is the best public policy. We as a group certainly do not subscribe to that. There are recent examples on the state level of passing legislation without any public hearings or comments. I think that right to work legislation that passed in the lame duck is one prime example of that. And under the auspices of financial emergencies, local elected officials have been marginalized. I think we know that we have an emergency financial manager now, and he told City Council, you guys can meet and talk and do whatever you want, but ultimately I will make that decision on what eventually happens, regardless of the public sentiment. And then also, under the auspices of financial crisis, entire municipal departments have been rolled into nonprofit organizations where the role of public input and oversight is not yet clear. And the example that we have is with the health department. As you know, it has been pretty much folded into the Institute for Health Studies or Health Population Studies, which is a nonprofit. And we just don't know as the public, what role they have in terms of transparency, accountability, and the provision of soliciting public input. And as you may know, that there is a trend of consolidating city agencies into nonprofits, and the one that is on the horizon is there's discussion about the Planning and Development Department will soon be rolled into the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, which, as you know, is a quasi-public, quasi-private entity that, depending on the issue, sometimes wears its private hat or will wear its public hat. So we get into community benefits agreements, and what are they? A community benefit, a CBA, is an opportunity for a community group to formally have their goals, objectives, and concerns incorporated into a written agreement with a developer. It generally works around economic development issues, but it's not restricted to that. The CBA is a signed contract between a developer and a community group or coalition that requires the developer to provide specific amenities and or mitigations to the community. In exchange for the CBA, the community will support the developer's project. This is generally seen as favorable because with community support, the developer can move forward generally at a fast pace, and also with community support, it will minimize the developer's risk. There's one thing that developers like to minimize, it's risk. The CBA can also sometimes be incorporated into an agreement between the local government and the developer. This can give the local government the power to enforce the CBA. One of the things that we found out working with Whole Foods Market, and that threshold for employment and using Detroit-based businesses, is that as the city of Detroit is consolidating, they are eliminating those positions that were in the past that enforced and monitored and regulated requirements such as Detroit-based vendors being a part of the construction, Detroit workers, and I believe that was the Department of Human Rights. For the entire city of Detroit, there's perhaps just one person working, and so there is no enforcement of executive orders that are on the book. And so I think a lot of contractors know that, and so they don't subscribe to those requirements. And again, that the whole environment that we're working under makes the CBA even more important in terms of holding developers accountable to communities. So what does the CBA cover? each community will determine the issues that impact them. Some examples are, and these are not the exhaustive list, but smart growth, gentrification, environmental justice, permanent improvement to the lives of the affected residents, local hiring goals, job training, minority women, local contracting goals. Just some examples. There are some cautions though with CBAs. One, you have to ensure that those negotiating for the community actually represent the community. With the, what was interesting with the bridge, I think Manny Maroon had some community groups that were completely funded by him, who portrayed themselves as community groups. But in reality, we're not as represented as they said they were. Then you also need to determine who negotiates on behalf of the community. Because sometimes the local government will say they are negotiating on behalf of the community, when in fact they have not got input from that local community. And then also, I think you want to have a community benefits agreement that is written so that there's maximum enforceability of that agreement. This CBA discussion brought back some memories for me, because what I realized as we talked about it, that my first job out of graduate school back in 1995 as an aspiring urban planner who wanted to change the world, I in fact participated in a CBA. We didn't call it a CBA back then, it was just called an agreement. And I'm just going to share with you real quickly before we go to the panelists. From 1995 to 1999, I was working with the lead contractor for the Detroit Housing Commission on a $90 million renovation of Detroit's oldest and first public housing development called Parkside Homes. For those of you who don't know, Parkside Homes is located on the corner of Warren and Connor, where they intersect across from the shopping mall, down the street from the old Mercy Hospital, and down the street from Wayne County Community College. At the time, we were the contractor who represented the Detroit Housing Commission. And so we were working there to do a major $90 million revitalization. There was some hostility though. The residents were very distrustful of the Detroit Housing Department back then. That's what it was called. Now it's the Housing Commission. And they had some right to be very distrustful. Back then, the only way you got money from HUD for public housing is if your development was in disrepair. The worse condition it was in, the more money you got from HUD. So those who were in fact affected by that were the residents, who would complain about the unsanitary, unsafe living conditions, and the Housing Commission at the time did not do the repairs because it would elevate their scores. They would not get as much funding from HUD. HUD has since changed that formula, but as you can imagine, the residents were very concerned about the unsafe conditions at the developments. So when the $90 million was coming in the plan, the residents were very concerned. They were concerned mainly for two things. One, that the redevelopment of Parkside would not include their input. It was a massive rehab, new construction, new streets, just a total, complete redo. And they were concerned that once they fixed up Parkside, they would not be allowed to move into the new units. That the management, the Housing Commission, would find ways to exclude them. You didn't pay your rent 18 months ago, your utility bill is late, or your child did something and that all of a sudden makes you ineligible for the new Parkside. And so there was a very tense situation. And the Housing Commission entrusted the company that I worked with to negotiate an agreement with the residents on behalf of the department so that we can go forward. Because at that time, in order to get the HUD money, it was called Hope 6 back then, you had to have resident input. Now what the Housing Commission did not know was that my boss was perhaps the nicest, most liberalist, pro-resident developer you could think of. And he was negotiating on behalf of the Housing Commission with the residents. And so on my next slide, I'm going to share with you some of the provisions he provided in the residents' negotiated community benefits agreement. So we got a CBA. And the first thing is we funded the Parkside Resident Council. Those are the residents who are living at Parkside, $350,000. We said, here, this is for you to help be a part of this $90 million redevelopment. And with that money, the resident council paid themselves. The president got a stipend, the secretary got a stipend. They hired an office manager. They had a contract with Xerox for a copy machine. They made copies and distributed flyers. And they did some other things that were pretty neat. They also were put as signatories on the plan that was submitted to HUD. They had to sign off on it. So what they did was they hired a nonprofit called the United Community Housing Coalition. And they came in and served as their advocates to make sure that the plan that was submitted to HUD represented the needs and the wants of the residents. So they had UCHC staff on site and at all the meetings as their advocates. Then they also, the CBA said that the PRC would sign off on all architectural designs for the new Parkside. So what they do, with that $350,000, they hired an architect who sat in on all the meetings to make sure that us, who worked for the Housing Commission, conveyed all of their concerns in the architectural drawings, and their architect had to review them and say, yes, what you wanted is in there, and sign off on it. And that architect that they hired, you may know this firm, it was Rainey Hamilton himself, who's with Hamilton Anderson. It's one of the larger architectural firms now in Detroit. Then they also said that they wanted to be assured that Parkside, they would be allowed to move back into the new Parkside. So they put that in writing, because the new Parkside would have a different type of management. And then not only were they concerned about the ones living there, but they said because of the Housing Commission's pattern of disinvestment, a lot of people left. They wanted to make sure that those folks who had left, when the Housing Commission failed to fix up the units to sanitary conditions, had first right to move back. And so that was a part of the plan. And then finally, with that $90 million, they established a mini United Way to provide funding for on-site service providers who were working at Parkside at the time. And not only would there be a mini United Way fund of $1 million, but the residents would be the ones to administer it and determine who got awarded the funding and evaluate the providers. At the time, we had, I think, 3 service providers. We had Friends of Parkside, which was a resident-based organization, and then we had the YWCA, and we may have had another organization offhand, I can't remember, but and so we wanted that money to be invested, and we anticipated it would make at least $100,000 to $150,000 a year, and the investment stream would be used to fund the on-site service providers, and it would go on perpetually. And so that was the CBA that I worked on almost 20 years ago. And when I was going in my basement, I found the letter that that the residents had written to the director of the housing department, and it pretty much codified what I just told you. So I'll just read to you real quick. The part that's highlighted says, in addition, we wanted to ensure that the current residents of Parkside Annex and the recent residents of Parkside Homes had the first right to return to Parkside regardless of Parkside's ownership. This issue, along with others, was incorporated into the revitalization plan through a further assurance agreement, a copy of which is attached, drawn up, and signed by the Parkside Resident Council and DHD prior to the formal submittal to HUD of the revitalization plan. We understand that the villages will continue to operate as public housing despite the change in ownership. And so that right there is just the letter that was used when we negotiated a CBA. Now, the one thing about CBAs that I do want to say is that they offer an opportunity for a win-win scenario. The developer wins, the residents win, and you have a long-term viable project. But there's also one more result of this head-to-head negotiation. And that is, when it's all said and done, you're happy with the project, you become friends with those who you negotiated with. And today, I was with the Whole Foods meeting, and Linda Campbell was there, and the CEO of Whole Foods just gave her all kinds of accolades. Now, when she met with him several times before, she was pretty stern and forceful in terms of what she expected for Whole Foods. And I can tell you, he wasn't very happy during those meetings that we had before. But in front of his whole management team that were from around the world, he gave Linda all kinds of accolades and said that her efforts with the community advisory group made them a better company, made him a better man, and he said this Linda was in shock. She just was like, okay. But I'm here to tell you.
Sign up for the Linda seminar.
And I'm here to tell you that it's true. When you work on these CBAs, it's a win-win, and you establish lifelong friendships. So when I knew that I was going to be talking about CBAs, I made a phone call to the Parks and Resident Council, and I have with me the current president of the Parks and Resident Council, who was a part of that negotiation that we did almost 20 years ago. And I told her about it. Ms. Catherine, can you stand up? We're still friends to this day, and she said, Kurt, I'd love to be at the presentation, and she was pretty smart too, because after we left the deal, she hooked me up and I became a board member of her organization. But the CBAs work, and you develop lifelong friendships, and so what I'm going to do now is, that concludes my introduction. I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and we'll start with Tova.